Today we're going to be learning about some of the basics of animating in Photoshop. It's always nice to start off taking a look at what you're going to build, so I'm going to show you this GIF file, and this GIF file is an animated GIF file. Here's a bonus technique. Whenever you have a file on your desktop or in a folder and you want to take a look at what it is, rather than always double clicking to open it up, which often means if it's a Photoshop file it needs to open up in Photoshop, different types of files might open up in Preview or something else, you can take a look at what it is at a larger size by simply clicking once on the file and then pressing your space bar. And this is the animation that we're going to create today. It involves fades and movement, and that's it. And because you should already be really familiar with Photoshop and you're able to bring in images and logos and create text and change text attributes like the typeface you're using, the color, etc., we're not going to build this whole ad from scratch. We're going to start off with all the elements in place, and then we'll apply some animation to this file. If you open up the Animated Banner Ad Tutorial folder, you should see a file called Medium Rectangle Web Ad to Animate.psd, and if you double click on that, it will open up in Photoshop. And before we do anything else, we are going to go to the Window menu, and you're going to make sure that your workspace is set to Essentials. And if it is set to Essentials, you're going to select Reset Essentials just to make sure that all your palettes are in the same place that you're going to see them on my screen. We're going to continue to refine our workspace by closing up some of these panels that are really large and in the way and taking up a lot of our screen real estate. Before I do that, I'm going to click on the Layers tab and I'm going to drag it up and out because we absolutely need to have our Layers palette visible. And I'm going to collapse these other panels by clicking on the double arrow icon, and I'm going to do the same thing with this panel as well. I'm going to click to collapse it to free up more space. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make my Photoshop window workspace shallower and move my layers palette out of the way. Once we've rearranged our workspace, we're going to go to the File Save As menu, and you are going to add to the beginning of this file name your last name and first initial. If it's not already going to automatically save into the Animated Banner Ad Tutorial folder, you can always click on Desktop, find that folder, double click to open it up, and you want to make sure that the format says Photoshop, and then we're going to click Save. Click OK, and now we're ready to start building our animation. You might be wondering why we made that Photoshop window so shallow, and this is why. Our next step is to go to the Window menu, and we're going to select Timeline. And then we're going to click on the Timeline tab, and we're going to click and drag it out so it sits underneath the Photoshop window. And then we're going to click and drag and extend it out. This arrangement does is it allows us to have our timeline window nice and big, and we can still see exactly what we're doing up here in the upper portion of the screen. Our next step is to click the Create Video Timeline button. And what you should notice is that every layer that you have in your layer palette also is represented here in our timeline window. When we start to work with images or video in some sort of time-based media, we stop calling these layers and we start calling them clips. You might notice here that layer 1 is completely empty. And what we're going to do is we're going to clean up our layer palette and our timeline window by clicking on layer 1 and dragging and dropping it to the trash can at the bottom of the layer palette. And what that does is it removes that layer from the layers palette, and it also removes that clip reference here in our timeline window. And that just creates a cleaner workspace for us. In our timeline window, we have playback controls. And there's no point in clicking anything because we don't have anything moving yet, but we will soon. And we have what's called a current time indicator, and we can click and drag this to different positions in our timeline. You'll also notice that there's what looks like a ruler along the top of all these clips. And it is a ruler, but rather than measuring distance, it measures time. So right now, if I'm looking at this, I know that this is at 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, etc. We'll start by making sure our current time indicator is set to the very beginning so it's aligned with 0. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to change the duration of some of these clips. Duration means how much time. And right now, each of these clips lasts the same amount of time. So when we click and drag our current time indicator, we don't see anything changing. We want to start our animation just showing the burger, and all the other information will come in after that. So to do that, we're going to click on our A&W logo clip, and we're going to position our cursor at the beginning, and you should see the arrow change to this funny looking kind of arrow configuration. And whenever you see that, it means that when you click and drag, you're actually shortening the duration or the length of that clip. And we'll shorten it so it's at the 1 second mark approximately. And then we're going to do the same thing with the other clips. We're going to click to select, allow the mouse to hover over the end until we see that funny looking cursor, and click and drag. Rinse and repeat with the button background and the button text. So we haven't really made anything move yet, but what we are doing is we're changing when things show up on screen. Notice that all the clips end at the same time, and if I click on my current time indicator and move through that timeline, which is referred to as scrubbing, you'll see that we see the burger until we hit the 1 second mark, and then all the rest of the information pops in. Remember what that example animation looked like. You'll remember that the logo faded in. I don't want to wait for a whole second for that logo to begin fading in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the clip duration so it starts a little sooner. I'm going to do that by clicking on the clip, moving my cursor to the end, and clicking and dragging so it's about at the halfway point between here and here. And then I'm going to move my current time indicator to the beginning of that clip. And now we're going to create our fade. To access the animation controls for each clip, we have to twirl the clip open. And we do that by clicking on that little direction arrow next to the name. And these are the properties that we can animate over time for this type of clip. We can transform it, which means we can move it from one point to another. We can change the opacity, and we can change the style. To create a fade, all we need to do is enable the opacity, and we do that by clicking on the little stopwatch. You should see a little yellow diamond shape appear in your timeline, and it's connected to just this clip. We use keyframes in order to make changes at different points in time. So right now we're going to make a change at the beginning of this A&W logo clip. We've enabled opacity, we have our keyframe, and now to make that change, we're going to go to the Layers palette. Right now, this A&W logo is set at an opacity of 100%, and we're going to change that to 0. And if you look in your timeline and scrub, you can see that that clip, because it's at 0% opacity, it's 100% transparent, so we can't see it. So this keyframe is remembering that at this point in time, relative to that ruler, this clip should be 0. Then we're going to move our current time indicator to the 1 second mark, where the rest of the clips begin. And we're going to introduce another keyframe by clicking on the keyframe button, which is that little diamond shape. And now we have a brand new keyframe, and we're going to assign a different opacity value to this keyframe. And we do that by returning to our Layers palette and asking the opacity to be 100%. So now we have two keyframes, but we have different values for the opacity. In this keyframe it's 0. In the second keyframe it's 100%. And if you click and drag through the timeline, what you should see is that logo being 0 in this keyframe and becoming gradually 100% opaque in the second keyframe. Once we're done adding keyframes and applying animation to a particular clip, we're going to get in the habit of twirling that clip layer closed before we move on to the next. We're going to do something very similar to the Beyond Meat burger layer. We're going to twirl it open. We're going to ensure that our current time indicator is at the beginning of these clips, and we're going to enable opacity. We see a keyframe, and we want the Beyond Meat Burger text to fade in as well. We move to our Layers palette, make sure that the Beyond Meat Burger layer is selected, and we're going to ask for an opacity of 0. Then we're going to move our current time indicator to about halfway between the 1 and the 2 second mark, and we're going to add another keyframe by clicking on the keyframe button. And in this keyframe, we want to change the opacity up to 100%. And if we click and scrub through our timeline, what we should see is we should see our logo fading in. After it fades in, the Beyond Meat Burger text fades in. We haven't saved in a while, so we're going to go to File Save or press Command S. Now let's take a look at how we can preview our animations. This portion of the timeline window gives us playback controls. Before we play back our animation, we're going to make one change in the gear icon area. So we're going to click on that gear icon, and you're going to set your resolution to 100%, and you're going to enable loop playback. Looping playback allows you to click that play button once, and the animation will just play over and over and over again, which you often want to do. I'm going to click play. Things are looking pretty good so far. And now we're going to look at applying motion to our button. And our button is actually two different elements, an orange rectangle with some white text on top. So we're going to twirl close our Beyond Meat Burger clip layer, and we are going to twirl open the button background. Move your current time indicator to the beginning of the button background clip. And we're going to enable the position option by clicking on the stopwatch, and you should see a keyframe appear in your timeline. And then we're going to move this all the way off screen. And we could click and drag and move it off screen, but we really want to make sure that we're moving it in a straight line. Sometimes the easiest way to move something isn't by clicking and dragging, it's by using your nudge keys. If you take a look at your keyboard, there should be a middle section, and you have these little arrow keys that point up and down and left and right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my arrow keys to move it off screen. And if I just click my right arrow key, and it's only moving 1 pixel at a time. I know that I want to move it a lot more than 1 pixel at a time just to make this whole process faster. So bonus tip, if I hold my shift key while I'm clicking any of my nudge keys, it will move in 10 pixel increments. And that just gets it moved a lot faster. And I know it's moving in a perfectly horizontal line. So in this keyframe, that orange rectangle is off screen. I'm going to move my current time indicator to be between the 1 second and the 2 second mark. And I'm going to ask for another keyframe by clicking on the keyframe button. And then I'm going to reverse the process. I am going to hold my shift key and press my left nudge key or my left arrow key on my keyboard. I'm going to scrub through my animation because one thing I'm noticing is that we have our Beyond Meat Burger text fading in at the same time that that button starts to move into frame. And I don't want those two things to happen at the same time. So I'm going to make some adjustments to the clip and the keyframes so that the Beyond Meat Burger text fades in completely before I start moving something else. To do that, all I need to do is position my mouse over the beginning of the button background clip and click and drag so that it starts its appearance further into our timeline or later into our animation. Notice that when I clicked and shortened the clip, the keyframes stayed behind, so I also need to move those. So I'm going to move my keyframes so that the first keyframe is aligned with the new beginning of this clip, and the second keyframe is positioned approximately somewhere between the 2 and 3 second mark. I've made a change. I'm going to scrub through and see if I'm happy with the result. So the Beyond Meat Burger text fades in, and then we see the rectangle moving into frame. It's been a while since we've saved, so I'm going to press Command S to save. And if you're not confident with your key commands, you can always go directly to the File menu and select Save. I'm going to preview what we have so far by clicking on the play button. Now that I've watched the animation, I'm really not happy with how quickly that orange rectangle is moving into frame. It's taking far too long to do something that's really not that interesting to look at, so I want to speed that up. So remember that in this first keyframe, that orange rectangle is out of frame, and then by the time it reaches the second keyframe, it's fully visible. So we still want it to move from the first position to the second position, but we want it to move faster. So all we're going to do is we're going to reposition the second keyframe by clicking and dragging it closer to the first keyframe. So the distance it's moving is exactly the same, but we're giving it less time to move, so it moves faster. I'm going to hit play so I can preview that adjustment to my motion and let it play back one more time just to make sure that I'm happy with it, and that looks a lot better. We're going to do something very similar for the type that sits on that orange rectangle. So I'm going to twirl close my button background and twirl open my Find Your Closest A&W text. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to shorten this clip so it matches up with the button background. So to do that, I click on the clip, I move my mouse towards the end till I see that weird cursor icon appear, and I click and drag. Because this is a type layer that we're about to animate, it says transform instead of position, but it allows us to do the same thing. We're going to set up this sequence of animation just a little differently. I know I want my type to end up exactly there. So rather than starting off by adding a keyframe at the beginning, moving my type, adding a keyframe further in the timeline, and then move my text into position and hope that I remember exactly where that position is, I'm going to move my current time indicator further down my timeline, and then I'm going to click the transform stopwatch. So this keyframe is recording the position of where that text is at this point in time. Then I'm going to move my current time indicator to the beginning of the clip, click to add another keyframe, and in this keyframe I'm going to position the text outside of that viewing area. And I'm going to do the same thing I did when I moved the orange rectangle. I'm going to hold my Shift key and use my right arrow key till it's all the way off screen. And then I'm going to click and drag and scrub through my timeline to see how that's moving. And I do have two things moving, but if you take a look at how the rectangle is moving and then the type is moving kind of a little bit behind it, so what we could do is we could adjust the position of the keyframes so that the text and the rectangle are moving at the same speed. But instead, let's do something a little different. We'll change the positioning of our keyframes so that the rectangle comes almost all the way in and then it's followed by the type. So to do that, I'm going to click on my first keyframe and I'm going to move it further down my timeline underneath that clip. So again, it's still moving from its position in this first keyframe to this keyframe, but now this event is happening at a different point in time. And if I click and drag and scrub through, you can see that we've got a rectangle coming in, and then our type just whips in at the very end. And that just creates a more balanced animation. I'm going to twirl closed the Find Your Closest A&W layer, and I'm going to preview my animation so far. And then we're going to add a finishing touch. Once the button comes into position and is there for a few moments, I want some sort of movement to direct the viewer's eye to that button element. So we're going to move our current time indicator to the 3-second mark, and we're going to twirl open the button background layer again. And what we'll do is we'll add a little bit of a fade effect. It's not going to fade completely out, it's going to fade out a little bit and then come back to 100% just to apply a little movement. So to do that, we're going to click on our opacity stopwatch we've got a keyframe here, and it's recording the opacity of that rectangle at 100%. I'm going to move the current time indicator further down the timeline, and I'm going to add another keyframe by clicking the keyframe button. And at this point in time, I want to change the opacity of the button background to about 60%. I'm going to scrub through that little piece of animation we've just added. So the button background is at 100%. It becomes a little transparent. And then we want it to pop back up to 100%. So we're going to move our current time indicator to about that position. We're going to add a new keyframe by clicking the keyframe button. And we're going to change our opacity from 60% back up to 100. I'm going to scrub through so I have my little bit of a fade, and it pops back up to 100%. And now we're going to preview the animation by pressing the play button. And that looks pretty good. And if you find that that fade effect on that button background is a little too subtle, you can always move your current time indicator back so it lines up with that keyframe. Click on that keyframe. Make sure that the correct layer is active in your layer palette, and change the opacity so that there's more of a dramatic change. So if we take it all the way down to something like 40% and preview our animation again, it stands out a little more now. Now that we've completed our animation, our final step is to save it as an animated GIF. So to do that, we need to go to the File menu, select Export, and then from that submenu, Save for Web Legacy. This window looks pretty intimidating, but all we have to worry about are our looping options here in the bottom right-hand corner. And we're going to set it to loop once, and then we're going to click Save, navigate to your desktop, find the animated banner ad tutorial folder and double-click to open that, and then click Save. And that's it. Now that you've completed this tutorial, you should be starting to feel pretty comfortable adding keyframes, adjusting the positioning of keyframes, and understand how to set up your clips in a timeline.